A desperate father sells his daughter to pay a gambling debt. The cowboy who bought her didn't even want a wife. But when he discovers she's there against her will, he does something that changes everything. What happens next will restore your faith in true love and second chances. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The rope burns on Elena's wrists had finally stopped bleeding, but the shame still burned fresh in her heart. She sat in the back of the dusty wagon, her few belongings clutched in a torn cloth bag, watching the only home she'd ever known disappear behind a cloud of prairie dust. Her father hadn't even looked at her when he'd made the deal. Thomas Garrett had lost everything in a poker game to Samuel Blackjack Morrison, the most dangerous man in 3 counties. The debt was $2,000, more money than her father would see in 5 lifetimes. When he couldn't pay, Blackjack had given him a choice: lose his life or give up his daughter to work off the debt. "Don't worry, Thomas," Blackjack had laughed, his gold teeth gleaming. "I know just the man who needs a wife. Jake Sullivan up in Montana. He's got money and land but no woman. Your girl will marry him and we'll call it even." Elena had begged, pleaded, even offered to work in the saloon to pay off the debt herself. But her father had already shaken hands with the devil. Now, 3 weeks later, she was sitting across from the man who was supposed to be her husband. Jake Sullivan was nothing like she'd expected. Blackjack had described him as desperate for a wife, lonely, eager for company. But the man sitting across from her looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Jake was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his hands through it too many times. His clothes were clean but worn, and his hands showed the calluses of hard work. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were cold, distant, like he'd built walls around himself that no one was allowed to cross. "I didn't ask for this," he said finally, his voice rough from lack of use. "Blackjack said you were willing. That you wanted to come west and start over." Elena's cheeks burned with humiliation. He lied. "I'm here because my father owes him money. $2,000. Jake's jaw tightened. "Gambling debt." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Damn," Jake muttered, taking off his hat and running his hands through his hair. "I should have known. Blackjack never does anything straight." They sat in uncomfortable silence as the wagon bounced over the rough trail. Elena studied Jake's face, trying to read his thoughts. He looked angry but not at her. There was something else there, disappointment, maybe even hurt. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked finally. "If you didn't want a wife?" Jake was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I'm tired of being alone. My wife died 3 years ago in childbirth. Lost the baby too." He looked out at the endless prairie. "I thought maybe it was time to try again. But not like this. Not with someone who's here against her will." Elena felt a stab of sympathy. She had expected to find a cruel man, someone who would buy a woman like she was cattle. Instead, she found someone who was hurting just as much as she was. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. Jake glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. It was probably the first kind word he'd heard in a long time. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena. Elena Martinez." "Well, Elena Martinez, here's what's going to happen. When we get to my ranch, you'll have your own room. You don't owe me anything and I don't expect anything from you. Soon as I can figure out how to get Blackjack his money, you'll be free to go wherever you want." Elena stared at him. "You do that? Pay my father's debt." "It's not your debt to carry," Jake said firmly. "And I won't have a woman on my property who doesn't want to be there." For the first time in weeks, Elena felt something like hope blooming in her chest. The Sullivan ranch was bigger than Elena had imagined. The main house was a 2-story log cabin with a wide front porch, surrounded by pastures that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Cattle dotted the landscape like dark spots against the golden grass. "It's beautiful," Elena breathed, and she meant it. Jake looked at her with surprise. "Most city folk think it's too empty, too quiet." "I'm not city folk," Elena said. "I grew up on a small farm before my mother died. My father, he wasn't the same after that." Jake nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. He showed her to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. It had a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the pasture. After weeks of uncertainty, it felt like luxury. "Mrs. Chun comes by twice a week to help with cooking and cleaning," Jake said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "But if you want to help out, I won't stop you. Just, you don't have to. You're not my wife, whatever that paper Blackjack made us sign says." That night, Elena lay in the small bed and stared at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jake moving around in the next room. She wondered if he was having as much trouble sleeping as she was. She had expected many things when she was told she was being sold as a wife. She had expected cruelty, demands, maybe even violence. She had not expected kindness. She had not expected a man who was as trapped by the situation as she was. The next morning, Elena woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Jake cooking breakfast at the wood stove. "You don't have to cook for me," she said. "I cook for myself anyway," Jake replied without turning around. "Doesn't take much more effort to cook for two." Elena watched him work. His movements were efficient, practiced. This was a man who had been taking care of himself for a long time. "Can I help?" she asked. Jake paused, spatula halfway to the pan. "You don't have to." "I know. But I want to. I don't like feeling useless." Something in her tone made Jake turn to look at her. Whatever he saw in her face made him nod toward the cabinet. "Plates are in there. Coffee cups too." They ate in companionable silence, watching the sun rise over the pasture through the kitchen window. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. "What do you do all day?" Elena asked. "Take care of the cattle. Mend fences. Fix whatever's broken." Jake finished his coffee and stood up. "There's always something that needs doing on a ranch. Could I help? I know I'm not strong like a man, but I can work. I'm not afraid of hard work." Jake studied her face. "Why?" "Because sitting in that room all day will drive me crazy. And because..." Elena paused, searching for the right words. "Because you're being kind to me when you don't have to be. The least I can do is earn my keep." Something shifted in Jake's expression. "All right. But we start easy. Don't need you getting hurt." That first day, Jake showed Elena around the ranch. She helped him feed the chickens, collect eggs, and tend to a sick calf. Her hands were soft from her sheltered life, and by the end of the day, they were covered in small cuts and blisters. But she felt more alive than she had in months. "You did good today," Jake said as they walked back to the house. "Better than I expected." It was a small compliment, but it warmed Elena more than she wanted to admit. Days turned into weeks. Elena threw herself into ranch work with a determination that surprised both of them. She learned to milk cows, mend fences, and even help with the cattle drives. Her hands grew calloused, her skin tanned from the sun, and her muscles grew strong from the constant work. Jake watched her transformation with something like amazement. The frightened girl who had arrived on his doorstep was becoming a capable ranchwoman before his eyes. More than that, she was becoming someone he looked forward to seeing each morning. Elena, for her part, found herself studying Jake when she thought he wasn't looking. She noticed how gentle he was with the animals, how he always made sure she had enough to eat before he served himself, how he stayed up late reading by lamplight. She noticed the way his face softened when he talked about his first wife, and how quickly he changed the subject. One evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, Elena finally asked the question that had been bothering her for weeks. "What was she like? Your wife?" Jake was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. She was sunshine. Always laughing, always seeing the good in everything. She could make friends with a rattlesnake if she set her mind to it." He smiled sadly. "She wanted children so badly. When she finally got pregnant, she was over the moon. We both were." "What happened?" "Baby was too big. Mary was too small. The doctor said there was nothing he could do." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "I lost them both in one night. The baby was a boy. We were going to name him Thomas." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "Jake, I'm so sorry. After that, I couldn't see the point in much of anything. I kept the ranch going, but that was about it. When Blackjack came around talking about a wife, I thought maybe it was time to try living again instead of just surviving. And now..." Jake looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. "Now I think maybe I was right, just not in the way I expected." The next morning, Elena woke to find Jake gone and a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to town. Back tomorrow. There's food in the pantry. Jay." Elena tried not to worry, but Jake had never left her alone before. When he didn't return by sunset, she started to pace. When he didn't return by midnight, she began to fear the worst. Jake finally rode up to the house just after dawn, looking exhausted and covered in dust. Elena ran out to meet him, her heart pounding with relief. "Where were you?" "I was worried sick." Jake slid down from his horse, moving carefully like he was hurt. "Had to see Blackjack. Took longer than I thought." "Blackjack? Why?" Jake reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a folded paper. Your freedom. Paid off your father's debt. You're not bound to anyone anymore. Elena stared at the paper, then at Jake. You paid $2,000? Where did you get that kind of money? Sold off half my herd. It's fine, I can build it back up. Jake, no. You can't do that. This ranch is your life. And you deserve to have a choice about yours, Jake said firmly. I'll take you to town whenever you're ready. You can catch the stage to wherever you want to go. Elena felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. For weeks, she had dreamed of freedom, of being able to leave and start over somewhere new. Now that it was offered to her, she realized she didn't want it. What if I don't want to go? Jake's head snapped up. What? What if I want to stay? Not because I have to, but because I choose to. Elena. Jake's voice was rough. You don't have to say that. You don't owe me anything. I'm not saying it because I owe you. I'm saying it because. Elena took a deep breath. Because somewhere along the way this started feeling like home. You started feeling like home. Jake stared at her like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. You want to stay? Really stay? Not just until you figure out somewhere else to go? I want to stay. I want to make this work. If you'll have me. Jake's carefully constructed walls finally crumbled. He crossed the space between them in 2 quick strides and pulled her into his arms. God, yes. Yes, I'll have you. I was hoping, but I didn't want to assume. Elena laughed, tears streaming down her face. You're assuming now. Am I assuming right? Instead of answering, Elena kissed him. It was tentative at first, then deeper as Jake responded. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. I love you, Elena whispered. I didn't expect to, but I do. I love you too, Jake replied. I thought I'd never feel this way again. They were married for real 3 months later, by the preacher in town with Mrs. Chen and the neighbors as witnesses. Elena wore her mother's dress, which she had carried with her in that torn cloth bag. Jake wore his best suit and a smile that made him look 10 years younger. On their wedding night, as they lay together in the big bedroom that had once belonged to Jake and Mary, Elena traced patterns on Jake's chest. Do you think she would have approved? Mary? Jake was quiet for a moment. I think Mary would have wanted me to be happy. And you make me happier than I ever thought I'd be again. Good, Elena said. Because I plan to keep making you happy for a very long time. A year later, Elena gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Hope. Jake cried when he held her for the first time, overwhelmed by the second chance he'd been given. She's perfect, he whispered. She is, Elena agreed. Just like her father. As Elena watched Jake rock their daughter by the window, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. She had been sold like property, brought to a man who hadn't wanted her, expected to make the best of an impossible situation. Instead, she had found love, partnership, and a home worth fighting for. She had found a man who saw her as an equal, who valued her strength and independence, who had literally paid for her freedom even when it meant sacrificing his own dreams. What are you thinking about? Jake asked, catching her watching them. Just, how strange life is. How the worst thing that ever happened to me led to the best thing that ever happened to me. Jake smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made Elena's heart skip. I was thinking the same thing. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, and the cattle lowed in the distance. It was the sound of home, of a life built on love instead of obligation, of a future full of possibilities. Elena had been sold to pay a debt, brought to a man who didn't want a wife. But sometimes, the most beautiful stories begin with the darkest chapters. Sometimes, 2 broken people can heal each other. And sometimes, love grows in the most unexpected places. As the sun set over the Sullivan ranch, Elena closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of her family, her husband humming to their daughter, the gentle creak of the rocking chair, the steady rhythm of hearts that had learned to beat as one. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold to pay her father's gambling debt. She was Elena Sullivan, wife and mother, partner and equal, beloved and cherished. She was finally completely home.